Good morning to most, good afternoon to others, and good evening to the viewing audience across the pond. I'm your host, Jason Miles, here for another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you're new to the channel, thank you so much for joining us on this lovely Saturday for me morning. If you're a returning subscriber, listener, or one of our very valued patrons, welcome back. So glad to have all of you here with us. As many of the patrons know, a few months ago we launched the Crisis Papers, a sort of bi-weekly series of essays, mainly by me. Now, these are free to all patrons, and depending on your Patreon tier, the magazine formatted version is free as well. If you are not a patron and would like to support this show and this type of writing, you can purchase the latest issue as well as all the other issues, all four, on the link in the description. Wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there is a link in the description. Also, for those that don't know, video essays are no longer on this channel, and all the new video essays moving forward will be hosted on Means TV. Also, they'll be hosting some of our shows as well. I'm pretty excited about that. They wanted to do the sports show. I was like, do you guys know how many dick and fart jokes we put into that sports show? But I'm here for it. But if you would like a discount for Means TV, 20% off, a monthly discount, bam! Use that code right there. This is Revolution, all caps, gives you a 20% off monthly discount. Also, want to send a big fat shout out to longtime TIR listener and patron, someone we've gotten to know in real life, Andy William. Happy birthday. Happy birthday. I hope you're watching right now, Andy. It's been a pleasure to get to know you in real life. We've had too much fun. It's like almost every time we go to New York, it's like, oh, we're about to see the homies and hang out with crazy ass Andy for a long time. So everybody give Andy a fat birthday shout in the chat. Today, we're going to talk about something that has definitely shaped my life. Better? Don't know. But the military entertainment complex. The military-industrial complex has long extended its tentacles into American culture, but its presence in the world of entertainment has become increasingly normalized. From dramatic flyovers at NFL games to the pageantry surrounding the national anthem, the intertwining of militarism and popular spectacle is no coincidence. The backlash against Colin Kaepernick's anti-police violence protest underscores how deeply embedded this influence is. Kaepernick's kneeling, a gesture meant to honor fallen soldiers, while drawing attention to police violence against poor people. Again, not the biggest fan of was co-opted and reframed, shifting focus from its original cause to a manufactured debate over patriotism. This is not a new phenomenon. For those of us who grew up during the Cold War, Hollywood served as a veritable factory of military propaganda. Films like Top Gun, Red Dawn, Rocky IV, and the latter Rambo installments explicitly framed communism as an existential evil, vanquished only by the supposedly superior virtues of American exceptionalism. But as our guest notes in their latest for Jacobin, the quote, the DOD and CIA's relationship with Hollywood doesn't exist solely to celebrate the military and affirm the validity of its objectives. It also serves a more functional purpose, to encourage enlistment at a time when the military suffers from severe recruitment shortfalls. Today, unquote, today, the military entertainment complex extends beyond films to video games like the Call of Duty series, which deliver distorted histories wrapped in narratives of American greatness and more communistic evil. These media forms do more than entertain. They shape public perception, normalize militarism, and subtly recruit In this episode, we'll discuss how the military entertainment complex permeates blockbuster films, video games, and even sports, using culture as a tool to maintain hegemony. Please welcome our guest, journalist Hamza Shehryar. Hamza, if I fucked your name up, you can yell at me.
It's pretty good. Yeah, hi. It's good to be here. Good to talk.
Um, I read your piece. Thank you. Shout out to Tucson for putting this show together. Um, I thought you were going to be a little older when you came on the screen. I was like, oh shit, this is a kid. This kid never fucking saw Red Dawn. This kid never saw Rocky 4. What are we even talking about here? Now, are you familiar with Colin Kaepernick, the NFL football player, and his kneeling protests?
Yes, yes, of course.
I know you didn't talk too much about sports in your piece, but here in the United States, for a game like football, which has become America's pastime, probably over the last, I would say, 40 years, it's really overtaken baseball, which for the longest time really was America's sport, right? That's why the national anthem in baseball games was such an important thing. But I would say maybe 15, 20 years ago, the military and the NFL formed this kind of disgusting partnership where the national anthem now takes precedent in football games, which is a relatively new thing. Um, and Kaepernick, initially, for those that don't know the whole story, don't remember it because it feels like it's been a million years ago. It's only been like 8. He initially just didn't stand for the national anthem, right? He just sat down, and he was injured too at the time. He wasn't even playing. But in a slow media cycle, this got all the attention, and someone questioned why. Excuse me, he had been sitting during the national anthem, and he says, "Oh, I'm protesting police violence." He kind of went more into it. He wasn't as flippant as what I just said. Um, and there was a huge backlash for not standing for the national anthem, as if this was something that was extremely un-American. And then Colin Kaepernick meets with a Green Beret, which I found kind of counterintuitive to the protest. And they had this meeting where Kaepernick goes, "Well, what can I do that wouldn't be offensive to you and soldiers?" And the Green Beret goes, "Kneel. If you kneel for the fallen soldiers, honoring them, um, then we'll let you have your protest." Pretty much, right? So Kaepernick kneels, kneeling becomes a thing. And then the kneeling even gets looked at as being un-American, which I find extremely odd, since that was the kneeling was the American compromise. But that is how kind of entrenched we are as a nation in these ideals of the greatness, if you will, where even when you meet with someone in the military, the nation is still like, no, no, no. And he's been, for the most part, blackballed from football as a player. He did recently turn down a job as a coach. But I wasn't sure if you were aware of like the Kaepernick saga. What is your opinion on all of that?
Yeah, obviously, actually, Kaepernick was probably how I was the only thing I know
Really?
about American football. It's not big into
Okay.
American football particularly. Like, obviously, I know what it is, but I've never followed it much at all. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think more centrally surrounding like patriotism, and I'm sure what we'll get into later on with like the military, industrial, and military entertainment complex. I think what I've always sort of found interesting is, as you mentioned, this notion that patriotism with like jingoism, you almost get into circumstances, and I think a lot of the films that we'll talk about will
Hmm.
suggest this as well, is where you almost feel like you've made America and the American flag into such an ideal that any criticism whatsoever is considered disrespectful, to the
Hmm.
point where people kind of feel like worshiping, in a sense, the flag is more important than what the flag ought to represent. Because I mean,
Mhm.
for a lot of the people that are hostile towards Kaepernick and otherwise as well, it's very much about, well, you're disrespecting the US. The US has all these freedoms, etc. The US military is a force for good. What he's protesting is a just cause. And
Mhm.
it's not really about what he's protesting or how he's going about it. It's this notion that America and the flag is sort of beyond any protest. It's beyond kind of like it's this notion that with American exceptionalism, particularly, it's like this is freedom, and it doesn't
Mhm.
matter who or what you're protesting, even if that runs counter to what we ought to represent, it's unacceptable. And I think particularly with sports, and as you mentioned with the NFL and the national anthem becoming so kind of like nationalistic,
Yeah.
particularly, I think that just manifests itself more than it would otherwise. But I think the sentiment generally persists.
I mean, what's funny about the NFL, and I'm not going to dwell on this too much longer, is that for the longest time when the national anthem was sang, players were in the locker room. They didn't come out till it was over. We didn't really have flyovers in football games. This again, this is a new thing. I mean, you talk about it in your piece when it comes to recruitment. You know, there's a problem because we don't have a draft anymore, and not too many people are in a rush to go, shoot poor people in countries overseas. But that being said, we are great with our poverty draft. We're winning there. Um, how has the relationship between Hollywood and the Department of Defense evolved over time? And what functional purposes does it serve beyond cultural affirmation? You write, in exchange for access to military bases, equipment, and expertise, filmmakers must submit their scripts to the Department of Defense for approval. And also, before you answer the question, I also want to let everyone know, if you're interested in Hamza's piece, wherever you're watching or listening to the show, it is the first link in the description is a link to Hamza's piece in Jackman.
Yeah, so with the DoD's approval, essentially, to be able to access the DoD's facilities, so this essentially means anything at all. So, for example, if you're making Top Gun or Top Gun Maverick, you want access to like fighter jets, Air Force bases, etc., or otherwise even in sort of like more kind of aspects. If you're making an action film, you kind of need military equipment. To be able to get access to that equipment, the DoD has to sign off on your scripts. You need to present your script to them for whatever film you're making, and if they're content with it, then they'll okay it, and then you can film at an American base or use an F-16 jet or whatever it is, right? You can put Tom Cruise in an F-16 jet. So what essentially happens, I mean, it's not so much, it's not so simple as like you'll present anything that's even slightly critical of like the United States Armed Forces, and they'll just be like, no, that's not how it works. I mean, there's some American films that are a little that, critical, but it's barely criticism. It's more so about maintaining the essence of what the armed forces ought to represent, that they're a force for peace and good, as opposed to an imperial army that invades other countries to keep the American empire going. And so what that's kind of led to is any major Hollywood production, from like the huge films, the likes of Top Gun, Maverick, your Marvel films, to even relatively more insignificant films, you need the DoD to be happy with what you're putting out. So even if you want to be somewhat critical, you can only go as far as like some people do war crimes because war is bad.
Yeah,
That's how far
it's
you go.
more
You
the
can't
internal
get
struggle,
You can't get
right?
into
The
the
internal struggle.
foundational elements of like why this is wrong. It's about, I mean, even when we look at certain American films that have been hostile towards the military in relative terms, right? We think of Platoon, we think of Apocalypse Now, for example. Those
Mhm.
films, in essence, are about Platoon, for example, is like the American military should represent or should do better than massacring innocent civilians. And even that film, it's about like, well, here's one person who saw what was going on, was fucked up, and the US should represent something other than what it was in the moment. That film isn't about the wrongfulness of invading Vietnam, for example, even though at the time, culturally, all of America was anti-Vietnam, right? Or
Mhm.
anti-Vietnam War. Similarly with Apocalypse Now, it's very much about the horrors of war. And that's all well and good. It's important, but when it comes to being critical of what the US represents, what imperialism is, the US empire, the military industrial complex, that's something you won't be able to kind of get the DoD to like sign off on. So if you want to make a film that centers on that, you need to kind of be more creative. You either have to kind of find a way to do that without military equipment, or to kind of tell that in a very kind of like independent, creative, different light, which just isn't going to reach as many people. So if you're making a war film in America about the US military, you kind of have to work within the constraints that the DoDs put you under. And that's kind of why, even as I've mentioned, occasionally the films that are critical of militarism aren't so much critical of empire. They're just critical of
Of
the fact
war
that
in the
bad things
abstract,
happen.
right? Like
Yeah.
even the
Yeah.
music of that. I was talking. We did a show maybe about a month ago about heavy metal, and again, I don't know if you're a heavy metal person. You don't have to be, but there's a band, pretty famous band called Metallica, who's had some of their biggest hits have been quote unquote anti-war songs, but they're not so much about militarism itself. It's not about empire itself. It's more about war in the abstract, man's inhumanity to man, injured minds, injured bodies that come back from the battlefield. And that's what we got in those movies like Platoon. There was one with Michael J. Fox, kind of about the My Lai massacre, where we see kind of the evils that men do, but that is good men that are transformed by battle and not the occupation itself. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
you talk about in your book about Catherine Bigelow's, who, because she did Zero Dark 30, right? Is she the same woman that does Near Dark?
Is she? I'm not sure
Because
actually.
Near Dark is like the best vampire movie that no one's seen. It came out the same year as
Mhm,
Lost Boys. It's like an
mhm,
adult version of the Lost Boys.
mhm.
I believe that's Catherine Bigelow. I could be wrong. Um,
Probably is, yeah. I'll
but
check. Yeah.
Zero Dark 30, you say, is extremely inaccurate. Can you explain that?
Right. Well, more so than inaccurate, it's defined by its omissions and framing. So in the piece, I actually go into quite a lot of detail. For example, I mean, in the film, Jessica Chastain, who is the lead character in the film who essentially brings down bin Laden. She's represented as this like girl boss, like who goes against like the command, works her ass off to like bring justice to the victims of 9/11. Um, she's someone who's like really uncomfortable with torture in the film. She wants to do right and also get to bin Laden, and then she has like internal struggles, etc. But the woman that she's based on was not like that at all. There's a lot of and I write about this in the piece. The New Yorker kind of looked into this as well, where the person she's based off of couldn't care less about brown people dying. There was an instance where this Jessica Chastain, essentially, who in the film is the self-proclaimed motherfucker that brought Bin Laden down, was okay with torturing people, even people that she knew were innocent because a mistake was made, for example, right? The film doesn't get into any of that, right? The film gets into torture and how torture is necessary, which in itself is a problematic kind of concept within the film, especially because that torture was not significant to actually the Bin Laden operation at all in the first place, the way that the film says it is. But more than that, it's about the fact that like you're basing a character who's supposed to represent like what American military is. You know, it's a it's supposed to be a meritocratic system where a woman can go up, bring Bin Laden down by herself, and like be good all while doing it. It's supposed to be a historical film. That's not how things went down at all. You know, that's one
Mhm.
example. Otherwise, within the film itself, I also mentioned that the victims in the film, you have to remember, because you'd forget this while watching the film, is that the US has invaded Afghanistan. They're in Pakistan. They've got their bases in Pakistan with the Pakistani military. They're torturing inmates at Guantanamo Bay illegally. Um, and they seem to be the victims as they're doing all of this.
Hmm.
Tens of thousands of people were killed in drone strikes, were kidnapped, tortured, people in Guantanamo that did nothing wrong. Yet with the film, you feel like it's those American people doing the torturing that are the victims. The framing is all about them. It's about, oh, look at these people. They feel so bad about doing this stuff. It's like, well, what about the victims? There's a bombing that takes
Yeah.
place in a hotel in the film. It's based off of a bombing that took place in real life in Islamabad. Over 50 civilians were killed. In the film, it's just about how Jessica Chastain's character survives, nothing
Hmm.
about the people that have died, for example. Um, and there's a lot more that you could get into. It's quite subtle. Um, and the issue is by the significant things that went down, right? The operation with regards to bin Laden is generally accurate. Like, I can't say the film's made things up,
Hmm.
but the details you're getting into are flawed, are problematic. The framing's all representative of how this is just, how torture is just, how Pakistani civilians, how brown civilians, how Muslims don't matter. They're untrustworthy collaborators at best and terrorists at worst. And I think it's things like that that make films, make the military entertainment complex so kind of it lends itself to nationalism because you'll watch that film, be unaware of what underpinned the invasion, how it went down, and oh, Jessica Chastain's a hero. The American military are heroes for bringing bin Laden down. But the havoc that you've caused in doing that, something that isn't something apparent in the film. And also, I know I've kind of gone on about this for a bit,
No,
but
that's fine.
it's all underscored by the fact that the CIA itself worked with Catherine Bigelow in a big way. There's internal emails that were leaked years later where CIA representative sent emails about how they want this film to be quote unquote like the film about the UBL, so that's Osama bin Laden operation. They want this film to be what the average American looks to understand how bin Laden went down. And so you can't be historically inaccurate per se because people will not take that seriously. But how you go about telling that story, what you include, what your framing is, how you represent your heroes and villains shapes a lot of people's perspectives. Because not everyone's going to go and look into investigative reporting. Not everyone's going to read about imperialism or what went down, right? People want to watch a film, want to understand what happened. And they watch Zero Dark 30, they think they know how things went down. They don't understand what the American military did to innocent civilians. Were what do you call it? What's the word in English? I'm forgetting. It's escaping my mind. Um,
For innocent civilians,
i- Innocent civilians
collateral
that are,
damage.
are killed, kind of. Yeah, collateral damage. That's it.
Collateral
Yeah,
damage.
sorry.
Is that the word you're looking for?
Yeah, yeah.
Collateral
I had
damage. Yeah.
a,
It's
yeah,
okay.
brain freeze in the moment. Yeah, collateral damage. Exactly. That's all these people are, and it's just. Um, So the reason I've kind of focused in on that film in the piece is because it's not so ridiculous as some of the other kind of like anti-communist film from back in the day were. People,
Hmm.
including America's kind of like liberal elites, see it as like an accurate, important feelings about what America represents. You know, it forwards the notion of like American exceptionalism. The film
Yes.
was nominated for Oscars. It's renowned worldwide as being a good film about like and it's also considered just and objective when it isn't. I think that's kind of why I focused in on this film because part of the industry or rather the entertainment complex is about propaganda, but a lot of it's about kind of making things more palatable, easy, omission, framing, etc. So yeah.
There's, I think that's also part of the love of true crime for a lot of people. Now, I don't know if you grew up in the West. Did you grow up in the UK?
I've spent a lot of time in the UK. Yeah.
Um, I don't know if it's the same over there. But there's this love of true crime in the United States. I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that I'm not a part of it myself. Where trying to get into the psyche of either rarely the victim, but every so often the victim, but more often than not, the perpetrator of the crime. Um, Police dramas that tell the story of the cops' internal struggle right? We grew up, if you're really old, you probably grew up with stuff like Dragnet, and then Chips. There was even a show called SWAT for a little bit, where it was just tough guys solving crimes. And then in the mid to later 80s, you get into shows like Hill Street Blues, where it's kind of what you're talking about, the internal struggles of these people in their day to day, and how the job shapes them and changes them and can make them bad individuals because they have to deal with these monsters on a daily basis. And I find that interesting because I think that all of this works in unison to really entrench that exceptionalism when you watch these new movies, because ever since the invasion, we've gotten these shows like Homeland, and I can't think of the one with Kiefer Sutherland, where it's always about capturing a terrorist and the internal struggle of having to do torture. And but that's kind of how we've been watching enforcement the whole time, right? It's not about the people that are dealing with the tragedy, right? It's about what's going on in the mind of the cop or the soldier who has to defuse the bomb, and when he comes back to America that he doesn't understand, and what are we doing here. And 24, thank you, Virtuoso. 24 is the name of the show. But all those shows, I think, work to, again, entrench us in this state of war is fine, these things are fine. They're just getting the bad people, because true evil has to exist also for us to support these things. And the struggle these people have, which is really what's kind of underscored in this, is the struggle against true evil. And that's
Yeah,
where, it gets really offensive for, us Browns.
yeah, no, for sure. I think 24 is an interesting example, isn't it? Because I think there was a Republican congressperson, I think, who cited that show as like rationale for
Yeah.
torture at some point. Yeah.
I remember that.
So
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's quite ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I've said this a couple of times, but it does come back to framing. But I think more so as well, it's a lot of these shows are catered towards particularly American audiences. So you do want kind of like the subjects to be these people who, and you want to sort of get into like their internal struggles and demons and whatnot. I think, but even within that, it's very kind of like it's very palatable, or it's black and white, you know.
Mhm.
You're getting into like, well, we're gonna do torture, but like if we do torture, we'll get bin Laden. That's not how it went down, for example, right?
Mhm.
There's other examples as well. So I think it's more about, no, I mean, obviously, black and brown lives are kind of like an afterthought in Hollywood. That's kind of generally been the case. But even otherwise, it kind of gets to like how you want to make sort of sweeping generalizations as to like what is right and what is wrong. But if you're making a war film, a film about something that happened very recently and the impacts reverberate around the world today, something that's underscored by imperialism and colonialism, for example, it's a duty, if you're a serious filmmaker, to kind of get to the roots of why that is the case, as opposed to just going on about, well, Bin Laden did terrorism, and now we're going to lose our values of freedom and justice. Or we're going to
Mhm.
push them to the boundaries to get even and have revenge, you know? Kind of boosts the myth of American exceptionalism as well. You know, this notion that we'll do what we need to, but that's not, the framing's all wrong. That shouldn't be how it should be.
The thinnest of all lines is between revenge and justice, and love and hate, as far as I'm concerned. Moving on. How do you think the Cold War era shaped Hollywood's militaristic narratives, and how are those influences still visible in today's media.
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting. I mean, it's quite a lot to get through, but initially, so I mean, if we go back to the early kind of the establishment of the military entertainment complex, it came as soon as the Cold War started. Very much, I mean, as it was the case with like day-to-day politics within kind of the entertainment industries, it was about why capitalism is better than communism in a nutshell. It's about why the US will kind of come out as the global superpower. And on the flip side, I mean, I don't know if you'll know or not, but
Mhm.
Soviet art, literature, film, music, incredible at the time as well. There was a serious notion, particularly around the world outside of the United States, of like kind of going outwards with propaganda
Yes.
as to explaining to people in the third world or non-aligned countries as to why the US is a force for good rather. So initially, as kind of like the anti-communist films from like the McCarthyist were being made, a lot of them were like facing outwards, made for
Mhm.
people all around the world, explaining to them why the US is just, why capitalism is great, why the Soviets are the worst thing since the Nazis, for example. Um, as that's kind of moved on, kind of especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's become a little more inward. I mean, it always was, obviously, but it's almost kind of centrally just about the United States and what the
Mhm.
United States ought to represent. I mentioned in the piece as well, kind of like the general anti-communist, anti-Russia sentiments persisted. Every year you get like a couple of kind of like cheap kind of like action thrillers about like some Soviet spy or Russian spy with like an accentuated jawline and a thick accent kind of like coming to destroy the United States.
Yeah.
But that's kind of, it wasn't, people didn't care as much because like, well, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of people that are like Russia is the biggest evil in the world still, but this isn't like 1970 or 80. And there was a period where it was very much like, well, yeah, what do we make films on? Like we don't have a common defined sort of enemy for the United States. And then 9/11 happened. And then since then, it's been kind of all about why the US is a force for good and why um, Muslims are essentially they've kind of replaced the Russians
For a long time,
in
I think Muslims did definitely replace Russians, especially after 9/11. And then it was
yeah.
it felt like with shows like Homeland and 24, they tried to give you this veneer of evenness. Like, look, there's some good ones. We're just out to get the baddies. But overall, it was pretty racist and it was pretty offensive. As someone that grew up in the 80s, where we had a definitive evil, which was another nuclear superpower, and the fear
Mhm,
was nuclear war, right? And I'm old enough to have had we called them earthquake drills because I grew up in California where and the San Francisco Bay Area where we did have a devastating earthquake in 1989. But those same drills that we were told were called earthquake drills in other parts of the country they're called bomb drills, and that was very common for even my parents generation to have these things called bomb drills because they definitely grew up in the Cold War as well. um it's it's funny to think that a movie like Rocky 4, which for me was just another Rocky movie, right? You could have made Rocky 48 when I was little, it didn't matter as long as I saw Sylvester Stallone beat up a black person apparently. But he finally had to fight a white guy for a change. um And that becomes kind of the ultimate in Cold War movies because if you've ever seen, and I don't know if you've seen Rocky 4, you should. It's all the Rocky movies are really kind of amazing. Um, I lied. 5 and 6, I'm not the biggest fan of. The Creed movies are pretty good, but when you watch Rocky 4 and he goes to the Soviet Union and he's being followed by the KGB. And then when he's fighting Drago and he starts to win the fight, all the Russian crowd is yelling his name. And you're like, that would never happen.
yeah. Very cartoonish.
Yeah. Oh man, yeah, this is the sad thing that Robert Booth says now kids have active shooter drills, which is even more sad. And then you
Yeah.
talk about movies like Top Gun where it's just nondescript brown people that are bad, which is really
Hmm.
funny. And if I'm not mistaken, because I get Top Gun and Iron Eagle confused. There's another movie that comes out which I think is worse than Top Gun, which is Iron Eagle. Now, I went to the movie. I can remember my mother dropping me off at the movie theater as a 9-year-old watching Top Gun and thinking how cool it was that, Tom Cruise is riding around in a motorcycle and fucking got a leather jacket and banging Kelly McGillis, like all that shit was really cool to me at 9. But it was Iron Eagle that was more realistic to me because that was about a group of young people and Lou Gossett who steal a fucking plane to go save Jason Gedrick's dad, who was illegally flying over what I think it was a made up country, but it would have been Gaddafi's. I can't think right now. What country was
Libya.
Gaddafi? Libya. Thank you. So sorry.
Mhm.
Not that you're Libyan.
That's
I'm just apologizing to all of Africa. Um, but that was a thing that actually happened. If you remember, well, you don't remember, but if you know about it, that was a thing that actually happened where Americans were flying over illegally that airspace and they were getting shot at. But in this movie, instead of making it out to be like, hey, why the fuck were you over there in the first place? Like, you had no business fucking with these people. They're not fucking with you. That's not part of the movie. The whole movie is he's minding his own American business, not in his area, and he gets shot down and taken captive, and this kid has to save his father. And that movie got played over and over and over and over on cable so much that I can probably recite it. And that for me was way worse than Top Gun. Because I honestly I know more people that know about the ambiguously gay volleyball game in Top Gun. The uncomfortable scenes with Tom Cruise and Val Kilmer than who they were fighting in that movie, because I don't know if anyone knows who they're fighting, because they're just so invisible. They never show their faces. That's how invisible they are. But in Iron Eagle, they actually have lines and they're shown to be bad people because they kidnapped this guy's dad and he had a multi-ethnic, multi-gendered coalition of friends that are going to save the day. Like that for me, and I can't speak for anyone else watching the show, that worked way better than even Top Gun or Red Dawn did to really cement American imperialism. And
Mhm.
I don't know what we have now that works that same way. Now you brought up some of the Marvel movies, and I didn't even know that Captain Marvel, because I haven't seen Captain Marvel. Um,
Mhm.
and not that I'm against Marvel movies. I am a nerd in every sense of the word. I don't say that ironically. Um, but Carol Danvers, if I'm not mistaken, even the comic book is military, right? And you said that the military actually were like co-producers in Captain Marvel.
Yeah. Yeah, the Air Force. So Captain Marvel, Brie Larson is essentially kind of like she's this like white, liberal, feminine face of American imperialism, right? But it's good. That's the entire purpose essentially of the film. And like I said, I think it's interesting you brought up the Iron Eagle because in more recent years the propaganda has been more subtle for a bunch of reasons. I think essentially with a film like Captain Marvel, for example, is that film came after 2 decades of the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, which for many Americans kind of put them off of this notion of like not so much celebrating the military, but like seeing like enlistment as like this rosy potential career that they wanted to get into, particularly for women, right?
Mm-hmm.
Reports of like sexual assault within the U.S. military, for
Mm-hmm.
example, and a lot of what was kind of what was being revealed, the war crimes, etc. And with Captain Marvel, what that essentially the purpose it served is to kind of make the military seem cool for like women, particularly young women.
Hmm.
Um, and that's the thing. I mean, with Marvel, with heaps of other films, like the military entertainment complex isn't so much like not every film serving the same
Hmm.
objective, militarism, celebrating American empire and imperialism, right? Even if it's not portraying it as such, but certain films are targeting certain sort of audiences in different ways. That's kind of why it is a complex. It's not all serving like one defined purpose, maybe as much as it was during the Cold War. Because back then the Russians were going to nuke America, right? That's not the
Hmm.
case anymore. You can't kind of get away with saying that. So it's kind of um, the complex is kind of working in different ways, reaching out to different people, kind of with the defined purpose, essentially, of celebrating American empire. And I think it's a good segue since you brought up Captain Marvel of kind of getting into the other kind of what else has changed over the last 50 years or so, which is increasingly the entertainment complex is now trying to get more people to enlist. That's a functional purpose now more than ever because the US military, as I mentioned, with Afghanistan, with the fact that for many reasons, social media as well has played a big role. It's not as cool or practical for many people to want to join the military even. The US has its smallest military now since the end of the Second World War. There's shortfalls every single year in all departments of the US Armed Forces, and they want to get more people to enlist. And with Marvel films in particular, be it Captain Marvel, be it Iron Man, Captain America, be it with video games that we'll get into more so I'm sure later,
Yes.
they serve this functional purpose of trying to make younger people want to join the military. With Top Gun Maverick, for example, I mentioned this in my piece as well. Across the United States, there were enlistment booths outside theaters. So there's people from the Air Force, from the US Armed Forces, kind of stationing themselves outside a bunch of theaters in America, hoping to get like a 16,
Hmm.
17. You've seen Glenn Powell shirtless, kind of uh, being like a bro fighting, sacrificing himself for like the American people. And they see that the idea is they want to be that. They want to be Miles Teller or Glenn Powell, or maybe Tom Cruise. I'm not sure there's that many like 16-year-olds that want to be Tom Cruise anymore, but like the entire purpose is they go to the film, they come out, they see the enlistment booth, they have this jingoistic nationalist fervor as they've walked through, kind of unaware of what they're trying to get into. So that's in many ways how functionally the military entertainment complex has kind of evolved and changed. It's as much now about like getting people to join the military as it is about like maintaining this notion that like the US is the greatest country in the world, right?
Hmm.
Before it was kind of just that. Now it's like, well, it's almost like this like hypocritical kind of like funny notion of how like the US country in the world, but like our military is kind of fucked up, so we need to find ways to get people to enlist. But that's the case with nationalism and imperialism. You kind of have to find ways to rationalize the hypocrisies, whether it be through the NFL and celebrating the flag and chastising Colin Kaepernick for wanting better, or otherwise, that's ultimately what it stems down to.
Which is again, which is funny because every time I think about Colin Kaepernick, I'm like, this was the epitome of a man trying to protect his brand, so to speak, and not piss off the country because he too grew up in this state of American exceptionalism. So that was the whole thing. Always looked like a big. What is anyone paying attention to what anyone's saying? Actually, but as far as Iron Man, now he's supposed to be a weapons manufacturer for the military, correct?
Yeah.
And they make weapons manufacturing a pro military thing, or they make a weapons manufacturer a good guy in some sense, or is he an anti-hero in your opinion?
I mean, I think the way Iron Man's portrayed, he is a good guy. He is kind of like again, I think it comes back to the fact that he's a weapons manufacturer for the greatest kind of force for good there is in the world. So that's why he's a good guy. That's the
Mhm.
underlying kind of like notion that no one's contesting. It's like which yeah, you're like you should like the more you think about it, like a weapons manufacturer shouldn't be a good guy. But when the entire shtick is that the US military's the only sort of force for good holding the world together from like going into a state of anarchy, then the weapons manufacturer becomes a good guy, or at least that's how he's represented. Because again, we're not getting into the fact that like these weapons are wreaking havoc around the world, whether it's
Mhm.
the besieged people of Gaza, for example, right now, or otherwise
Mhm.
around the world, as has been the case for the last 60, 70, 80 years.
I wonder how they portray that, how they're gonna try how they're gonna attempt to portray that in the upcoming Marvel movies. Now, I do wanna get into something that I have not done in probably 20 years, which is play a video game. I do understand they exist. I understand they're very popular with the young folks, but I haven't played a video game in forever. The last time I was even around a video game was I was tour managing a band that actually did a song that was on the Iron Man 2 video game. So we got a free trip to a convention called E3, I think it's called, which is a big video game convention in Southern
Yeah.
California. Major, and Call of Duty was being launched, the Black Ops game, I believe, at that time. So they had the whole parking lot as a promotional gimmick, with fake soldiers, and the whole parking lot looked like you were in an encampment, like you were captured or whatever. And they had like big screens playing the game. It looked really cool. I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that it's not. It didn't look dope, and I can see why people love playing these games. I'm not anti video game at all. I just personally don't do it. What role do video games like Call of Duty play in promoting a skewed historical narrative, and how do they serve as indirect recruitment tools?
Right. I think for the first part, I'll actually give you an experience of mine. I think that'll answer the question better than I could otherwise. So, not so much anymore, but I was big into the Call of Duty games back in the day. So with Call of Duty Black Ops 1, it came out, I think 2013, 14, I'm not sure, around that time. I was quite young. I wasn't politically active at all. I didn't know anything, right? So the name Fidel Castro to me meant nothing. I knew he was like related to politics in some capacity. That was it. So I'm playing Call of Duty in the campaign quite early on. There's a mission where you invade Cuba and you assassinate Fidel Castro.
Wow.
As you assassinate Fidel Castro, there's a woman, it's his bedroom. It's implied that she's like a sex slave or something. He kind of holds her up, uses her as a human shield before you
Mm.
kind of shoot him in the head in the video game.
Jesus. Okay.
This is my first exposure to Fidel Castro. I was like, what, 13, 14, 15 at the time. And in that moment, for me, it's like, okay, this is like an evil dictator. He's
Mm.
a terrible person. He's like the force for evil that the US needs to wipe out. It's all justified. I don't know the political implications back then, right? And with all the Call of Duty games, I know on the little like the disc, the box you get, it says 18 plus. Most people that are playing that were like I was at the time, young teenagers, right?
Yeah.
This is the first exposure they're getting to like who the US has deemed to be an adversary, a terrorist per se, right? So Castro is a psychopath that is willing to like who's like taken up sex slaves and is using them as human shields to protect himself, right?
Mhm.
That's the exposure to politics to a young person. Within the Call of Duty series, not well, I mean with Castro, it's overt. It literally is Castro. But there's other games where you've had like Venezuelan dictators that pose like striking resemblances to Hugo Chavez. You have a general who is for all intents and purposes, Qasem Soleimani, for example. And there's people who kind of detach from like politics, whether they're young or otherwise, have heard these names and can make the parallels, but they don't know who these people are. And in the video games, they're seeing this very kind of like Americanized, like retelling of like realities as they kind of panned out. And that's their exposure to what these people are, to politics, to imperialism, to war of time and an interest actively or something, someone giving you a book, giving you a different perspective for you to question that. Because if you're an American, particularly, I'm not even American. I took this up as like, okay, it must be true because it's in a video game. Because like, why would you lie? People kind of live with that,
Mhm.
and unless you do unlearning, then you're gonna think that Fidel Castro was a psycho maniac who was willing to kill Cuban women to protect himself from whatever it is that he was doing. I think that
Did
kind
you
of
have good
answers the question
parents?
probably. Yeah.
Did you have good parents that took
Fortunately,
you
yeah.
aside? Did they take you aside and say, "Oh, Hamza, please don't believe this BS," or did you just learn it in school?
I think probably a bit of both. I
Mm,
think with revolutionary politics, I think that kind of came from people I was around. So I think you know this, but for everyone that's listening, I was born in Pakistan and I lived there during the most of the war on terror. I was kind of forced to leave because it became anyone that could potentially book a flight out, that's what the goal became. You know,
mhm,
with drone strikes, indiscriminately targeting people and whatnot. That played a huge role because the consequences of empire were all around me. And yet still I kind of took in all the American propaganda as it came in growing up, right? Playing video games, watching film and TV, because that's what you're all exposed to. So it's hard to do the unlearning, and you kind of need to actively either have someone tell you things the way they are or see it with your own eyes to kind of understand um, this how skewed the realities are and how malicious they are. And that's kind of what shaped my interest in looking at a lot of this stuff as well. The
mhm.
military, the entertainment and industrial. I can completely imagine if I was an American, if I was born in I don't know, California, Arizona, whatever. And I didn't have this like outward kind of like experience with imperialism and the empire. I may well have been one of those kind of like MAGA maniacs who think like the US is a force for good and it represents like world peace or whatever. So that's why I think kind of sidetracking a little bit, it's important to actually talk to people as well and explain to them, well, I mean, Fidel Castro is a Cuban revolutionary who overthrew a Batista government, which was insane, right? There were the circumstances in Cuba before the revolution
Yeah.
were atrocious. People couldn't go to schools. They didn't have food to put in their bellies, roofs over their heads. Just because the American empire tells you one thing doesn't mean it's true.
But that's the hard part to try to explain to
Academics.
people.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
know, when you
and yeah,
think about how long these narratives have been in the minds of not just, like you said, young people like yourself, but their parents and maybe even their parents' parents. To So now you have 3 generations of people that believe that Cuba is this island of evil that
mhm,
was intent on blowing up the world. And if you watch a movie like Red Dawn, what makes Red Dawn so hilarious is that it's Cuba and Russia invading the United States and winning,
yeah,
and Cuba as a military superpower, which again, it's a small island nation next to Florida, but they invade Colorado. I still don't understand the geographic logistics of that. And again, as someone that's watched Red Dawn a million times, I've admitted on this show, I definitely have cried at the scene where they go to the encampment to find their father there and he tries to avenge them and stuff like that. Um, I also understand that it's a bunch of bullshit and it would never ever happen. But I think a lot of Americans see Red Dawn as America's struggle against this constant godless evil, and not the flip side. Because Milius, the guy that made it, is a crazy right winger. Really, not the biggest fan of women either. It's the same guy that made the Conan movies, by the way. Um, you can flip it and go, well, actually, the Americans in most countries, the Americans are the bad guy. They're the invading force that comes in and blows everybody to bits and shoots the teachers for no good reason. Um, and it's, you know, rebels in Afghanistan that are the Wolverines, if you will, the good guys, if you will. That's really hard for a lot of people to understand because again, we're just so entrenched in this idea that we're the ones constantly struggling against a godless empire, which is also weird to think about. It's like if we're like the richest nation in the world, why are we always struggling against much poorer places? Why does everyone think Afghanistan is this military stronghold?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's probably the most ludicrous part as well, because on the one hand, you're rationalizing all your military spending, and the fact that you've kind of left millions of Americans in destitute, right? The Americans don't have access to universal health care. Most Americans live paycheck to paycheck. They struggle in poverty. And you're kind of you convince a lot of Americans as well with is the fact that the military needs to be able to protect you and your rights. And then at the same time, you're presenting the same people with this fictitious threat that like Cuban guerrilla forces or the Soviets, or now it's like Afghanistan or Hamas, for example, is going to invade the US and like
Mhm.
kill you all. So you need to keep ramping up the military spending even more. I sometimes it's difficult for me to kind of come to grips with like how how like this convinces so many people as well, like how entrenched does the kind of propaganda need to be? And then secondly, it's like if that's kind of if there's someone living in, I don't know, in anywhere in the United States that thinks that like Hamas are gonna come in like paragliders to like invade their town, and how do you explain to them? How do you explain to them that like where do you start? That's what I sort of struggle with. So yeah, it's kind of it's 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 difficult. Yeah, I'm kind of struggling to kind of find the words to like how what do you do? Where do you go? I think it comes down to the fact that nationalism, militarism is so deeply kind of rooted, particularly in the United States. It defines American, this myth of American exceptionalism as well. And when something's that deep rooted, it's difficult to pull the roots out. So um, I think to me, it's something I think about quite a lot. I'd be interested to kind of get your perspective on kind of how you go about getting people to understand.
Um, there's someone in the chat right now because when you do these shows that are just kind of open to the public, and it says military on there, you're always going to get some like gung ho yahoos. And there's someone right now in the chat that had the audacity to say America allows me to do this show, which I don't understand what that means because I live in Mexico. And then they responded with, "How is the cartel treating me?" And I was like, "Just fine. Violence here is extremely different than violence in the United States. I haven't seen a school shooting. Nobody shot up a shopping mall here. Um, so there's that. But it's hard because you first have to look at the first thing I do because I do come across more people than you think, even living here in Mexico, that are really entrenched in the ideas of American greatness and lies about what Latin America is or isn't. And generally, it's lies about what communism is or isn't. I remember not too long ago, I was at a local bar that I go to and watch football games at, and somebody was talking about they had to go to Costa Rica because they were there and they had medical procedure, and they were like, "Well, Costa Rica is communist," and I was like, "No, it's not." I just said just like that. I was like, "No, it's not." He was like, "Well, yes, it is." It's like, "Nah," and he was like, "It's in Latin America." I was like, "I don't know what that means, but there's no communist nations there." But if you see what goes on in these places and you understand it as, well, there's a dictator in power and they're a communist because that's how dictatorships work, right? There are all these communist things, and here in America we don't have dictatorships, we have blah blah blah. And I'm like, well, explain to me who the dictator is, because they had an election in said country. you know do you really want to talk about fair elections from the United States standpoint? This is a pro-Trumper. And then he was like, "Well, that's a good point." I was like, "Well, I don't understand why you think that this one nation is so corrupt, but you understand what fairness is. You say you've been to a nation that has free healthcare, but it's communist and that's bad, but you had free healthcare, you know, then that had to get into a conversation about, well, the hospital was kind of dirty he was in because it was the county hospital and blah blah blah. And I was like, well, if there's private medicine there, that means it's probably not communist. So there's that. And second of all, if there's a private medical infrastructure, of course, the one paid for by the state is not going to look as good as the private one because they function differently. You know, this is how
Mhm.
capitalism works. And then you see people's wheels start turning in their heads, and it's harder for them to push back on certain narratives of greatness when you explaining to them like, well, this is what you want, right? You want rich people to have the best and poor people to suffer. And of course they go, well, no, it's not what I want. Well, it's like, well, then tell me what you want and explain it to me in your terms what you want. Because I don't know
Mm.
if you know what you want.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I've encountered that as well. Um, there's a lot of people. I mean, it's the age-old kind of adage, right? That everything I don't like is communism.
Yeah. Yeah.
It persists in many ways even today. I mean, I've seen people. This was bewildering to me. Say that Kamala Harris was a communist. You know,
Which is
MAGA
hilarious.
Trumpers were saying, which is
Yeah.
like, wow, like, it's like, where do you start? But
Mhm.
yeah, no, I definitely I agree as well. I think you have to kind of just engage with people and explain to them, kind of unpick what they think and understand as well. Um, but I found a lot of people will have kind of will be genuinely surprised when they learn things, but still kind of refuse to change positions. And I think that's where kind of the entertainment complex comes back as well, because you'll hear something you don't like, or it's like difficult to kind of tolerate or um palette, and then you can just go back to watching Invasion USA with Chuck Norris or like
I'm so
Red Dawn.
surprised you know that movie,
Yeah.
dude. When you said that, I started cracking up. Again, you can watch Canon Films put out a lot of pro-Israeli films because they are two gentlemen filmmakers from Israel. I think one of them passed away, who made insane Israeli propaganda films. And I believe Invasion USA was a Canon film. And they made the Delta Force movies. Um, they made quite a few movies that just even, and there's other people that made these movies where for no reason whatsoever, there would just be a communist regime they were fighting just for no reason. Like watch a film from the 80s called Strike Commando with Reb Brown. Oh, there's a scene where he goes back to Vietnam. This is all after Rambo 2 comes out. You talk about Rambo 3, but Rambo 2, that is the entryway drug into American exceptionalism. So there were all these Rambo 2 knockoffs that were made in the 80s, and Strike Commando is one of them. It's probably my favorite. I can watch it over and over again and cry laughing every time. So for some reason, this guy is deep in the jungle. This American he's on this covert mission to rescue American captured GIs that for some fucking reason are still in Vietnam. And in the mission, he accidentally gets blown away and floats away on this river into this really small village in Vietnam where for some reason everybody fucking speaks English. Um, and the village is being terrorized by Russians. Again, I don't understand why there's Russians here in Vietnam for no good reason. They're not setting up a base. They're just there fucking with poor people, right? There's no physical advantage to them being there. Anyway, this American is tasked with he comes to in this village and they're like, American, you are here to save us because you're American. And I'm like, what Vietnamese people in a little village would be this juiced to see an American and think he's there to save them? That's weird too. But anyway, they're like, you have to kill this guy because he's a traitor. He's been selling this out to this Russian guy, and the American guy won't do it because he's got such integrity. And this is also really poorly acted as well. You have to see this movie. And so he encounters this young boy that is really just all about him. He's enamored by his Americanness. And the young boy goes to him, and for no good reason, he's like, American, will you take me to America? What goes on in America? And the actor looks at the kid and he goes, in America, there's a place called Disneyland where the streets are made of chocolate.
It's like a parody of like an empire.
It it's a serious movie. That's what's
Yeah, but
it's one of the Italian
yeah, yeah,
knockoffs. Yeah.
yeah. It comes across as like, yeah, that's the thing. It's like
Oh,
it's so ridiculous, but like, hey, that's yeah.
it's I can't tell you enough on how much I love watching this movie. And then the American goes with a ragtag bunch of Vietnamese people and they just shoot. It's one of those movies where like they shoot 4 shots and like 25 people fall and there's just explosions everywhere. And it it's worth a watch to see how far down the ridiculous rabbit hole this stuff went. Um, but hilarious film. Please check that out. I'll give you a list of more canon films you can check out since
I'm definitely intrigued.
since you have this love for propaganda. Also, anything by Andy Sedaris. Oh, those are also some great Cold War propaganda films um, to check out. What is your favorite Cold War propaganda film?
Oof, that's difficult actually. You've put me on the spot. Hmm. I think maybe Rambo 3. I just think looking back at Rambo 3, this
Mhm.
particular fighting alongside the Mujahideen, only for them to become like America's next military industrial kind of Soviet Union. I just think there's like an irony in how that kind of presents like the ridiculousness of it all, right? I just think
Mhm.
kind of as like film history, as like cultural history, having like side his Mujahideen brothers, only for like 20 years later, Jessica Chastain kind of torturing people to get to Bin Laden, and how kind of I just love kind of like the fact that that's kind of led to that. Like how there's like layers of like empire and like fucked up foreign policy that like take you from Rambo 3 to like America's next kind of film and like entertainment villain. I just think I find that aspect of Rambo 3 to be quite uh, hilarious in almost a morbid way. Um, but yeah, otherwise, I'm a big fan of the ridiculous stuff as well, just because it's yeah, it's quite bewildering, even when you know what's happening with a lot of like I mentioned Invasion USA as well. It's like
Yeah.
what is going on? So I think yeah, I like the ridiculous aspects of it, but as someone who's kind of interested in film history, particularly, I think Rambo 3 and how it's aged as well, it's quite interesting how unique kind of that is.
Well, there's a shout out to the Mujahideen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like that's what I think about. It's like yeah, you went from like the personification of like the American military shouting
Mhm.
out the Mujahideen to like 20 years later making movies about how evil the Mujahideen, or as they're known later, the Taliban are. I just think that kind of sums up the lunacy of like empire, imperialism, and the military industrial complex in this kind of almost hilarious, ridiculous way.
It also helps. What is fascinating to me, and what I've kind of realized living down here in Mexico. And then I toured for years as a musician in various parts of Latin America as well. What's also been real fascinating to me has always been the fact that people assume that all nations work in a vacuum. Like there's never negative influence from places like the United States, especially people in Latin America that believe that their nation operates in a siloed way that has no influence. Like the United States doesn't negatively influence why they're economically precarious. And granted, a lot of nations have had bad leaders over the years, But when you do have a leader that comes in that says, how do we lift, I don't know, 40 million people out of poverty as defined by the United Nations, right? Um, we're going to have to do these programs and blah, 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 blah. That person is then a dictator and deemed persona non grata. You get sanctions put on you. God forbid you're a petrol nation, because then, the states are going to work with, the Emirates to make sure, like, we're going to fix the price of oil at some point to fuck you over, because we want American business back in there taking things over. That's really, even for people that think that they're in the know and they do that. Well, I'm from here, so I know better than you. It's like, I understand you're from there, but it doesn't mean you know better than me.
Hmm.
You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
I mean, you mentioned you live in Mexico over
Mhm.
since AMLO kind of came in. America has not been happy. And it's like, well, I mean, AMLO's a dictator, like it's insane, right? Now, the new president, I forget her name,
Claudia
was it Claudia?
Scheinbaum.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Claudia Scheinbaum's won an absolute majority
Mhm.
of the Mexican vote, and she's like a dictator because she wants to sort out the. I'm not gonna speak as an expert, but from what I've read
Mhm.
and Mexican courts because they're
Yeah.
not in the US's interest. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
the description of dictators kind of lost its meaning in essence, and I think it's just kind of engaging with people and explaining it to them, like what is dictator, you know?
What's interesting is,
Mm,
like, again, people that don't understand, and this is really cool because there's all these, insane people in the chat that have no idea what goes on in Latin America or Mexico. Um, to assume that having benefits for the elderly, which is the most vulnerable population, if we just take the United States to look at, because if the United States is the greatest nation in the world, then why is the growing population of homeless people elderly people? And if you look at homeless statistics, you're seeing that this growing population of homeless elderly are people that have never been homeless in their life before. So that means that living standards have changed so negatively that people that have had jobs, social security and pensions aren't enough to cover their living expenses, and now they're forced to live in their cars or trailers or, God forbid, on the streets. We're seeing this uptick in buying things like um, trailer parks, so the actual land, so you can have your modular home or trailer home, and you pay a space rent on the land where you're supposed to get city water and blah blah blah. And a lot of these places are increasing the space rents to the point where people can no longer afford it. Again, this problem is a crisis of capitalism, not a crisis of poor decision making. And the United States doesn't really care about the elderly population because it's a population that can't contribute to capital. And here you have a country that understands it suffers. It's a capitalist country here in Mexico, and it suffers a similar problem. And they're trying to have programs that are helping out the elderly, because to undo the fuckery of, I don't know how many years, it's going to take a while. And where do you start? And they decided to start with the most vulnerable of populations, which has been pretty interesting to see, and to see how people appreciate that, because we all get old and then we can't work anymore. And also in the United States, there's a myriad of articles that have come out saying once you hit a certain age, even if you're just looking for a menial job, nobody's hiring you. I'm 47. Target ain't hiring me. Walmart ain't hiring me. If I don't have gig work to do, I'm shit out of luck. If this podcasting doesn't pay off, so become a patron. But that's my take. Yeah, Political Pain says the trailer park spot rents have skyrocketed. Yeah, it's a legitimate problem in the United States.
Also, I mean, as someone who spent most of my life, I've never been to the United States. I'm always quite surprised by how many Americans think uniquely American problems are global. Um,
Hmm.
it's quite fascinating. I encounter a reluctance to kind of look outside elsewhere at happenings anywhere around the world. There is this kind of like, I think, coming back to like American exceptionalism, this notion of like America is the world, like America has to be independent, whether it's in otherwise the rest of the world. There's always something innately unique or exceptional about Americans and America that means it doesn't work like the rest of the world, whether it be in like everyday services, the organization of the economy, or otherwise. I haven't really encountered that talking to people elsewhere. Even kind of right-wing nut jobs in like the UK and stuff. They'll actually look outwards to the US. But I've never really encountered Americans. All throughout elsewhere in the world to kind of see how things can and ought to function and how you can make a better state, a better world.
We, if you again, when you, as you know, right, you have the news that comes in from where you live, and it looks very different. Use your VPN. You want to play a fun game with yourself? That didn't sound right at all. You want to play a fun game? Use your VPN and log in to anywhere in the United States, preferably the South. Doesn't matter right now because there's a conglomerate that owns a lot of local stations as well, so they report the same stories. And look at how American news will report where you live or even the region you live in. It's so incredibly different than what actually happens. Like if I catch wind of news in Southern, because I'm on the border, so I'm near Southern California. So if I catch wind of Southern California news, and then I run into a friend or something, and they're like, "Dude, you live in Mexico?" I'm like, "Yeah." They're like, "Oh man, so violent there." I'm like, "I don't." Again, there's no school shootings here. Like, what do you think happens here? Well, there's the cartel. It's like, why do you think the cartel is a bunch of assassins running around sicarioing each other on a daily basis? I mean, that may happen in their world, but the spillover, and everything depends on where you live. But right now, Tijuana, which I'm going to this once this show ends, I'm going to finish my coffee out of this cup and take a bus, a local bus to Tijuana, which a news show said was the most violent city in the world. I walk around there at all hours of the night, early in the morning. It's a lot of fun. It's got a great food scene, a really good music scene. Um, but I've never, and I don't, again, I'm not trying to, seen the violence that people talk about. But if you watch American news, the moment you go across that imaginary line called the border, you're going to get kidnapped. Someone's going to sneak drugs in your car. They're like, be careful because they sneak the drugs. They put a thing in their car. It's just like, maybe, I'm sure that happens to somebody. But you know who I've heard that happen to the most is broke military dudes. Broke military dudes that come down here because you can. There's a base not too far away, maybe about an hour drive, and liquor's cheaper. Yeah, somebody can come to you and be like, "Hey, I'll give you so much money to fucking take this package across the border because you're a military guy." That goes literally underreported because that would show negatively on the greatness of the American military that underpays its cadets to the point where they would risk prison time shuffling dope across an imaginary line.
Yeah, it's a powerful way to put it.
But yeah. What else are you working on, young man?
I mostly do film. I mean, I generally do more uplifting stuff, to be honest. But I've always been fascinated with propaganda in film, particularly. So that'd be a good piece to write about. the piece we've discussed today. Um, Otherwise, just the general film stuff. Not particularly revolutionary per se with my writing. I mean, there's always revolutionary undertones. It's kind of defined my life. But yeah, less heavy stuff for now. Um, but yeah, uh, nothing long term or like nothing rigid planned for now, just kind of
Mhm.
writing about film, occasionally about the odd kind of political events and stuff. And I work with a bunch of publications freelance, just covering news or whatever it is that needs to be covered. I mean, as you know, neoliberal capitalism affects us all. We kind of have
Yeah.
to do and write about things we don't necessarily love writing about to get by, but um, that's the plan, I guess, for now.
Well, I'm excited to see where you go again. When you came on the screen, I was like, "Oh my god, this is a very young person." So, if you're writing
Yeah,
this already at 24, I'm blown away, and I can't wait to see what you bring us next.
yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate that. I hope I didn't fumble my words too much. I'm one of those people. I got into writing because I feel like I do a better job kind of getting my thoughts across. But I hope like the people that have listened have kind of enjoyed, have learned a little bit at least, whether it's about how the entertainment complex works, the more kind of practical, pronounced role it's taken in recruitment, how kind of video games, the role video games serve, for example. I hope there's something fruitful that y'all have taken out of this conversation, and I've enjoyed it. I've appreciated it.
Well, thank you very much, Hamza, and I appreciate your work, and I appreciate you. And I'm not joking. I'm going to send you. I'm going to give me like a day. I'm going to gather a list of some fun movies that you should check out that involve a lot of American ridiculous propaganda and almost a buffoonish look at communist regimes in the '80s that didn't even exist. So I'll send you that,
Yes.
and hopefully there'll be some new gems on there you haven't seen. So thank you very much for taking the time to hang out with me today.
No, yeah, for sure. I look forward to kind of, yeah. Thanks for having me.
Peace. Can we give a kid a shout out on that mullet? Fuck. He had a fat ass mullet. He came serious as fuck. I did not know this was going to be the show that was going to get the fucking right wing crazies on here. Um, which is fun. Which is fun because you can see how ridiculous the extreme version of most people are. Because anything you say in an online setting is extremely, and especially in a chat, is going to be extremely extreme, right? You're just going to go off, call people names. You're going to rattle crazy non facts off. I can, so the computer's on the side and I can kind of see things on the side. I'm not wearing my glasses. And some of the few things I've seen on the side have been amazing about how the cartels run all the elections here. That's pretty funny because I don't think they were paying for those Morena and PT and Green Party campaigns that I saw ad nauseum during the election in my neighborhood. I don't know what programs those people were running on that would have been pro cartel. So if the cartel runs Mexico, you'll have to explain to me why the want to have better social services and the cartel who benefits immensely from the poverty here, right? That's how you turn people. Hey, you don't have any fucking money, Javier? Come sell dope for me at a very low level where you're extremely disposable, and I'll give you more money than you would have made um, had you had a job here. Like why they would want the government to raise the minimum wage and work standards to give people health care that have jobs where they get paid through a paycheck, because a lot of people get paid under the table here, sadly still. But I don't know why the cartel would be pro those programs. But, you know, I've seen some of those movies too. And everybody Mexican has like gold pistols. That's pretty. There's guns. There's no gun stores here. Guns are brought in from the United States. What? Yup. So I don't know where people are getting the gold pistols from in all the movies where the cartel guys have like cowboy hats and gold pistols. There is a barbecue place here that plays Mexican country music. Not would not like norte music, but like legitimately like shitty American country music, but in Spanish. Maybe those guys have the gold pistols somewhere. I just haven't seen, and I'm not trying to see a gold pistol. What's funny is this person's like, act like cartels don't exist. I never said they don't exist. They exist like a motherfucker. But do they exist in the United States? Do you call it something different? Who's the biggest drug dealer in your neighborhood? Douche Gadoo 47? Is it CVS? I don't know. Tell me about the drug problem where you live, or it doesn't exist because you live in the land of greatness. I want to know. I want to know about how drug-free America is. There's no gangs there. And if there is a gang, apparently it comes from south of the border because that's where all the problems are coming from, south of the border. Nothing homegrown. As someone that's spent way too much time in the South and certain parts of the North, I don't think that influence of crime, of criminal behavior is coming from south of the border. Oh, no. No, 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 no. So that's the fun part of seeing, again, out of the corner of my eye, right? The last thing I saw was, you stay in Mexico. It's like, well, yeah, I do. I have no problem going back, but I do visit my family quite often, and I will be back in the United States. You're not going to do anything about it. And I'm probably going to go to the South again, and you're not going to do anything about it there either. You're just not. You're not going to try to fight me. I'm going to tell everybody where I am because it's probably going to be a public event. And you're not going to show up. So there's that. Gotta love an internet tough guy. Because it's funny to be an internet tough guy against the person that's literally running the show. Like, why would you do that? You're gonna have a fucking coup or something? It's retarded. Be better. Be better. Okay? Be better. I want to read some of the fun comments you guys left on the screen. It's an interesting point you brought up about Kaepernick. The symbolism of the kneel being connected, honoring the fallen, is something I never thought about that way. Exactly. Hella gay Jamie. Jamie, are you from the Bay? From one mullet to another, sick mullet. That kid had a sick mullet, we have to admit. Metallica featured Johnny Got His Gun in a video. It was the one video, which is a pretty fucked up representation of war. And then this is a quote from that video, which is in that movie. For democracy, any man would give his only begotten son. I remember that Jason Robart says that, I believe, in that movie. That's what he goes. That's when everybody had to get a double bass pedal. When that riff comes on in one, it's all about the palm mute and the double bass pedal. I was hooked, and that's what I was going to do for the rest of my life. The irony is, I have never written a double bass pedal riff. I've played it in songs, but I've never really written one of those like machine gun. I love them. If any song has it, I'm all about it. That's why I love Slayer. Prairie Fire, Kowalski, Nebraska. I've been enjoying the last few Modern Warfare game campaigns. All the problems are do U.S. recklessness or incompetence causing a large crisis, and you are tasked to fix the screw up. Oh, interesting. Again, I don't play these games. I don't know anything about them. Charles Muller said the kid was channeling Swayze a bit. Yeah, Yeah, a little bit of Roadhouse in that. A little bit of Roadhouse. American people don't care about reality, just personal comfort. Ooh. Timothy Cornerson. God damn. Is that true? Is that true? It feels like it sometimes. What's comfortable is to think that there's worse places, I guess, than where you live. So there's that. This is really funny. Iron Eagle is Temu Top Gun. That's fucked up, dude. But is that racist? Because Lou Gossett was in Iron Eagle? I don't know. Once again, Prairie Fire. Then the opening of Red Dawn, the one black rural school teacher in Colorado was the first person killed on screen. What the fuck? He is. And I always forget that. It's not horror movies black people die first in. It is American propaganda films that black people, if they exist in them, they will die first. There you go. American movies that have themes of war somehow has to be curated officially by the military for image purposes. Yes, we explained that on the show. That is so true and quite frightening. Call of Duty literally rewrites history at times. LOL. For many guys, Russia was the one who did the highway of death in Iraq. Very, very true. Actually, Hamza writes about that in his piece. Again, wherever you're watching or listening to the show, the first link in the description is a link to Hamza's piece. We had a super chat here by the David Epps. My first exposure to Fidel was the arcade game Guerrilla War in the bar my dad hung out at. What were you doing hanging out at a bar? What the fuck is going on? Are you trying to unload some of your trauma on us, man? And finally, over the next decade, the number of elderly homeless Americans is projected to triple. And that was before COVID-19 hit. In Phoenix, the crisis has already arrived. Yes. And I don't really see too many shows talking about it. America is so good that you can talk shit about it and still come visit. Guess what? I can talk shit about everywhere in the world and go visit. Maybe China might be a little stricter. Maybe Iran might be a little stricter. And definitely certain parts of Korea. But for the most part, you can go anywhere in the world and talk a lot of shit. And if that's your fucking base for how great where you live is, then you should probably try to find a better thing to have as your base of greatness. This idea of free speech, because it doesn't exist the way you think it exists. Because people have literally lost their jobs over things they've said. So that's not 100% true. So there's that. What's it like to live in a bubble of ignorance? On that note, I'm going to go to the cartel haven and go take the cartel sponsored bus. And if it is a cartel sponsored bus, as Ben Burgess calls it, it's just a big minivan with extra seats. Bougie Ben. It is a very little bus. And only one time were we on the bus with a fighting hen. That was just one time the cat brought his fighting hen on the bus. Generally, there aren't animals on the bus. There's no fucking service animals. Just someone had to get from point A to B, and they just picked up a new fighter for the cockfight. We got to meet the cockfighting fighter. So that was a fun trip. I'm going to ride on that bus, and I'm going to walk around Cartel Town, and I'll take pictures, and I'll put them on some social media site. So all the people that are angry, go to This Is Revolution Oakland on Instagram, and I'll put them there. And then you can see all the evil cartel stuff, the drug dealing, And the rows of homelessness. Oh, that would be me in San Diego. Sorry, I won't be in San Diego, but yeah. Andrew Mulhern says cockfighting on the bus is illegal in a lot of places. They weren't cockfighting on the bus. It was just someone brought a prized fighter on the bus. But I can't read all these comments. But you guys are really funny. And I hope Blacky Funny Fuse or whatever. I can't read all of those. When people combine their name like that, I'm too stupid and blind to read it all. I hope you watch all the other episodes. Maybe we'll meet in real life. Maybe you'll be angry enough to challenge me to an arm wrestling competition. What the Cold War taught me was that real battles are settled in the arm wrestling arena. Sylvester Stallone taught me that. And maybe you're the guy that turns his hat backwards and defeats me in an arm wrestling competition. But only through arm wrestling will this be resolved. So if you're ready for it, if you're ready, I will meet you at any truck stop in America because I've been to damn near all of them. You want to meet in Iowa at the world's largest truck stop? Let's do it. Arm wrestle my fucking ass off. Do I use a sepia photo? That's really funny. Am I going to use a sepia photo? No, I'm not going to use any filter. You're going to see it all. I'll go to the crazy bar that Ben calls the bar from dusk till dawn, who they did a remodel at the bar. And there is one picture up on Instagram. I'll put some more up because I had to do a photo shoot thing for Means TV. And to really hammer Ben's point home, they made the bar vampire fucking themed. I shit you not. When you go into the piss trough area, the first thing you see is Nosferatu. I was like, oh my God. And over all the bathrooms now are different vampires. And then there's this huge like vampire mural with like the Lost Boys cast and what's the movie? Dracula, Gary Oldman's Dracula and all this other shit. I'm like, man, I think you guys watched a couple episodes or something and really doubled down on the vampire theme because this has become Dracula's bar. And they do free food now. You go in the bar and there's this seems like it's not the safest, but again, it's cartel town. The cartel lets this regulation happen where you can grill food kind of indoors. They're grilling carne asada tacos. If you go in the afternoon, go in carne asada tacos, and the waitress will be like, "Hey, how many do you want? Can I get like 3 carne asada tacos? Yeah, sure. You want salsa on them? We're making salsa in house. What? So for vampires, they're pretty fucking cool vampires. But they should be a little more discreet in letting you know that this is the vampire hangout. That being said. I really was going to do the outro music, and then Timothy Cornerson wanted to write the best comment of the day. Jason said, "Why ain't no black vampires on your wall?" Timothy, you won the show today. That is the funniest shit ever. That is the funniest shit ever. Why is there no black? I should go there and say that because there was no pictures of Blade. I'll look again. I didn't see Blade. I've been teasing people here about being racist since Trump won. I said Trump won the Latin vote. What do you say about that? They've been cracking up. But I hope I find a picture of Blade, because I don't want to believe that these wonderful people omitted the greatest vampire of all time. Can we just admit that Blade is the greatest man? Can we all agree on this? Like, who's a better vampire than Blade? Like, seriously. Seriously. Blade is just, he's got the fucking cool car in the movies. He's got the motorcycle in the comics. He's got 2 ninja swords. Hella guns. He's a vampire with ninja swords and guns and can do dope karate. How racist do you have to be to hate Blade? Like, seriously. You have to be an amazing racist to hate Blade. If the racists in the chat are still here and you guys hate Blade, you really need to go talk to your God about that. Because that shit ain't right. Blackula sucks compared to Blade. He has no ninja swords. He can't do karate. Karate! Come on, man. Remember Blade's old school in the first movie? He's got a homie that just makes dope weapons for him? Come on, man. Who didn't want to be Blade? If I did go to the bar and accidentally hook up with the vampiress, before she bit me, I'd be like, are you biting me to turn me or to eat me? Because can you do me a favor? If you're going to turn me, can you do a Blade? Because I just want to be Blade. I would ask that question. But if you hate Blade, this is the greatest troll comment of all time. Wesley's cool, but since you like him, I got to change it up. That's hilarious. Made my fucking day with that one. You know what you guys are saying? All of you, you're getting together in your troll chat and you're going, "We coming for you, nigga." And I'm saying, I'm here for it. That's what I'm saying. You know where to find me. Tuesday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific time. Saturdays at 9 a.m. Pacific. You know where to find me. Tell your trolly friends to come on through, because I'm here for it. I'm here for it all. Because you know in the depths of your trolly soul that Wesley Snipes is the greatest vampire of all times. You know it. You know the fucking blood sprinklers in the underground rave. Dopest scene ever when Blade walks in. He steals the show in the new Deadpool Wolverine. Wesley Snipes is like 60 something. Badass. Certified badass. You know it. You know it. So tell your trolly friends, come on back now, you hear? When am I coming back down south? I don't know, pretty soon. I have to go visit some people that I know in some facilities down there. You guys are making it sound like you're going to come have your shotgun hello for me. We got a shotgun meeting party for you, brother. Give a fuck. I worked in the Gulf of Mexico. I give a hot fuck. Blade versus Aaliyah? Come on. Come on. It's not even a match. Not even a match. Well, goddamn, this fool's like, I don't have a date booked. Goddamn it. I'm still trying to get through the holidays. I'm broke. Think I just got money to go gallivanting down south to meet somebody I don't know in real life? Why don't you come down? Look, nigga, I literally live in a vacation paradise. I know how to make gumbo. I don't need to fucking come down there for the food. And I was known for my biscuits and gravy. Still am, by the way. Switches. Wow. This is hilarious. No. I mean, why would I go there for that? You can come here and you can come hang out with the cartel since they're everywhere, apparently. But wow. Anyone that says they like Kroll definitely hates America. This is how you guys can tell someone that doesn't like America. Tony Red said, nah, it's all about Kroll for me, child of the 80s. As a child of the 80s, Kroll is like, that's Temu Star Wars right there. Temu Star Wars is Kroll. You guys want to be mad at someone that doesn't love America? You be mad at someone that loves Kroll more than Star Wars. Okay. That's what you need to be mad at. Accept the fact that Wesley Snipes is the greatest vampire of all time. And then hate on people that like Kroll more than Star Wars. That's where your ire should really be. Not on the fact that there is a propaganda complex in the United States that kind of promotes a lot of lies. Beastmaster, still not better than Star Wars. Good movie. But Deathstalker is better than Beastmaster. If you catch my drift. All right. I'm going to go. And I will see you guys Tuesday. Don't remember who the guest is yet. And on that note, I am out.